afternoon to you all. A warm welcome. My name is Therese Schumann Magnusson and I'm Director of the Nordic Africa Institute. At today's webinar, which is hosted by the project Making Politics Safer at our Institute, Professor Lyn Ossome will be reflecting on her groundbreaking book within the context of the continued manifestation of gendered electoral violence in Kenya. The webinar intends to address several questions, of which some are: what shifts can be observed in the nature of gendered electoral violence in Kenya? What factors continue to drive this violence, and how should governments and policymakers adapt to respond to these shifts? And what lessons can be learned from the case of Kenya? Global development data shows that increasing women's participation in politics leads to more equitable development. However, we also know that women do not always have the freedom to participate in elections as voters or as candidates. Many times, violence is used to keep women from voting and to deter them from running for political office. We are very privileged to host Professor Ossome for this webinar, as her work provides a history of the development of democracy in Kenya, drawing on the experiences of women. More importantly, it explains the complex relationship that exists between gender, ethnicity, and violence in Kenya's elections. Kenya is often celebrated as one of the leading beacons of democracy in East Africa, and this title is well earned. Kenya has a well-established multi-party democratic system. It holds regular and transparent elections, and it is home to a robust network of human rights and civil society organizations that work hard to hold the government accountable. However, Kenya's transition to democracy have not always been peaceful. The post-election violence of 2007 is evidence of this, and the youth-led finance bill protests that took place in July in Nairobi also show how violence can erupt while citizens are exercising their democratic rights. As such, this webinar that focuses on violence in Kenya's transition to democracy, it comes at a pertinent time. However, if we zoom in on the title of the webinar, we see that it adds on the extra concerns of gender and ethnicity, important, crucial aspects that do not get enough attention in social sciences research. And as researchers and policymakers, it is our responsibility to find effective solutions to global problems. If we are to respond adequately to the problem of gendered electoral violence, we must engage with the underlying societal factors that inform and drive this violence, which is the aim of this webinar. This webinar thereby also aims to look forward in order to map out strategies to reduce, mitigate, and prevent gendered political violence in the future. Such strategies are of relevance to other African countries and to the world as a whole, which is currently experiencing a retreat of democracy. One of the Nordic Africa Institute's core strategic objectives is to increase knowledge co-creation between the Nordics and African partners. So we are so pleased that today on the panel, we are hosting colleagues from Makerere University in Uganda and from, Zalendo Trust in Kenya. Additionally, there are participants with us today from UN Women Kenya, Badili Africa, CMD Kenya, Heinrich Böll Stiftung Nairobi, and KYMCA. All these organizations were key in assisting 9 researchers while they were conducting their fieldwork in Kenya. We are grateful to these organizations and hope that we can continue in this new knowledge co-creation and the bridging of African and Nordic perspectives. Colleagues, with those welcoming words, let me now hand over to my colleague, Diana Hyland-Madsen, Senior Researcher at the Nordic Africa Institute. Diana, over to you.
Thank you very much for these opening remarks. My name is Diana Hyland-Madsen, and I'm a Senior Researcher at the Nordic Africa Institute and the moderator for this webinar. I'm also delighted to welcome you to this webinar on gender, ethnicity and violence in Kenya's transition to democracy, mapping the shifts and continuities, hosted by the Nordic Africa Institute. The webinar is the fourth in a series, so I hope to see you all again. The webinar is part of a new research project entitled Making Politics Safer, Gendered Violence and Electoral Temporalities in Africa, with a particular focus on Ghana, Kenya, and Zimbabwe, and funded by the Swedish Research Council. You can learn more about our project and watch the recordings of the other webinars on the project homepage. Currently, we have finished the data collection in Kenya, where Shingirai Mentero and myself were in the beginning of this year. This webinar takes a point of departure in the very important book by Lyn Ossome from 2018, Gender, Ethnicity and Violence in Kenya's Transition to Democracy, States of Violence, which is key to understand the workings of Kenyan politics and how women have been silent and excluded from political spaces through violence. The book also demonstrates how intersections of gender and ethnicity have made some women more vulnerable to violence, and how processes of mapping gender and ethnicity onto women's bodies take place. The book is an inspiration for us, and I strongly recommend it to anyone interested in this field. Sadly, its focus on violence seems very relevant with the ongoing violence related to youth protests and the state responses against these protests, and at the time of our visit, also murders of women in Kenya. During the webinar, we will address how gendered electoral violence manifests itself in Kenya today, and address the key questions which was mentioned by Therese. To help us in answering these questions, I'm very happy to welcome our main speaker, Lyn Ossome, the author of this amazing book, Associate Professor and Director of the Makerere Institute of Social Research at the Makerere University, and also President of the Council for the Development of Social Science Research in Africa, in short, often called CODESRIA. It is also a great pleasure to welcome our discussant, Shingirai Mentero, who is a postdoc at the Nordic Africa Institute and also affiliated with the project Making Politics Safer, working together with me, and Caroline Gaita, who is the Executive Director of Muzalendo Trust, Kenya's premier parliamentary monitoring organization. Caroline is a strategic communication and governance specialist, writer, media and public relations practitioner, public speaker, and experienced non-profit director. I am looking very much forward to a stimulating debate. It will be very interesting to listen to our speakers. First, Lyn will talk about the main points of her book for 25 minutes. Second, our discussants have 10 minutes each. That is Shingirai Mentero and Caroline Gaita, who will discuss the key messages from the book in relation to the current Kenyan context and their experiences as respectively a researcher and practitioner. Third, we will have a general Q&A session where all of you can write your inputs in the chat and I will put them forward. Please, Lyn, the platform is yours.
Thank you, Diana, and thank you to Shingirai and Caroline for agreeing to engage with the work, and to the Nordic Africa Institute for this invitation. The book is about 6 years old. It's a book that came from my own doctoral work, which took place much earlier. But what I set out to do in the book, what I set out to do in the original work, actually, when I went to the field, was just a kind of anecdote before that. The interest in this work actually began at the back of the 2007-2008 electoral violence that we experienced in Kenya, which was the most violent electioneering period that we had seen in Kenya since the resumption of multi-party democracy in the early 90s. But it was by no means an exception. But 2007 was quite particular. It pushed a lot of us into the field. And what struck me at the time, when I was at the time working with the women's rights organization, and I was collecting data on women who had experienced sexual violence or different forms of gendered violence, who had been raped. And most of that work, partly because of the inclination of the NGOs, was among low-income households. And I spoke with around 200 women. And some of those cases were really extreme, women who had been gang raped. And, there was one woman who had actually her limbs broken. She was plastered all the way to her legs because she'd been gang raped. And I kept, of course, I went with my own kind of notions around the physiological harm of rape. It was vicious, but all she kept asking me was, what are my children going to eat? How are we going to survive? Many of these women, where they live is where they also trade, in the low-income living areas. You're selling your tomatoes, whatever, outside. And so when the violence breaks out, and their businesses were being destroyed, but they were also being raped. And this was the narrative across. They were all thinking about this economic loss and talking about, of course, that we'll never vote again. There are a number of them who burnt their voters' cards. And one of the questions, of course, at the back of that was, I couldn't. It was clear that there was a link, but I couldn't know whether the people who were committing this violence, their intention had been to rape the women and the destruction of the business was collateral, or it was the other way around, whether the intention had been to destroy the businesses and rape was collateral. I didn't know that. So when I went into the longer study, these were questions. But it also became very clear to me that we were missing a lens which was around the political economy of sexual violence. Why do some women experience violence and electoral violence in these ways and not others? So I set out what I set out to write was to develop actually a kind of structural critique of sexual violence in the context of democracy, of multi-party politics. And what I ended up grappling with, what the book actually ended up becoming, was a kind of critique of liberal democracy itself, grappling with this paradoxical relationship between democracy and violence. And this has remained an occupation of mine until today. So contrary to the literature that valorizes multi-party democracy, multi-party politics as a means of containing violence in society, as a means of stabilizing political contestations, the book asks why it is that Kenyan elections in Kenya, and these are just Kenya, I think we see it in many other African countries or post-colonial contexts, why is it that elections are not producing stable and safe ways of political contestations? And the book is fundamentally argues that the structure of colonization is such that modes of political organizing that do not account for the identitarian legacies of colonial rule, whether it's gender or ethnicity or class or sexuality and so on, or caste, I imagine in other contexts, that these modes that don't account for these identitarian legacies end up actually reproducing the historical violence of the colonial state, of the state. So in this regard, liberal democracy, liberal democracy, as we know from the literature, does not deal very well with difference, with these questions of difference. And in a sense, then it harbors within it a tendency towards violence. There's something inherently violent about a mode of political organizing that doesn't account for difference that was so fundamental in how the colonized were organized. So in the introduction of the book, I set out a couple of arguments. One is that while the women had not been the subject proper of the colonial state, we were not visible, we were not extremely relevant as political subjects, but the appropriation and exploitation of women's productive and reproductive labor towards the reproduction of the settler colonial political economy was actually a condition of possibility of the stabilization of colonial rule, of native rule itself. So a lot of the sort of dominant literature around the colonial rule that has tried to deal with the native question, most prominently, of course, Mamdani's work, Citizen and Subject, but many others have focused on, the native, have posed the native question, how would a racial minority, a white racial minority, govern a majority native population. This was, and many of those texts have dealt with a political question, coming up with the idea of a bifurcated state and, of course, indirect rule. And I absolutely am convinced by those arguments. But from a feminist perspective, from a feminist political economy perspective, we have to ask a further question: what was the condition of the stabilization of indirect rule itself? And we know from, especially in our studies of settler colonialism, that the migrant labor regimes presumed, in fact, a domain of reproductive labor. The social reproduction question was very fundamental to that stabilization. And these were the ways in which women actually became visible to the colonial state, but not yet acknowledged as proper political subjects. So women's legibility as subjects, their subjectivity in a sense, could not actually be understood concretely outside of their roles within those tribalized realms of reproduction. The other point to make is that whereas colonialism was obviously reinforced by a structure of violence, violence was actually not an overt feature of the immediate post-independence period. We didn't transition into a violent state. There were relative periods of stability, where there was thinking around redistribution, minimizing the effects of colonialism. So violence was not an overt feature of that immediate period, in post-colonial period. So the question is, why then have we seemed to move further and not closer to stabilizing our polities in the period of democratization, or under this long period where we've been trying to democratize? Again, scholars like Mamdani talk about an incomplete democracy, or incomplete transition to democracy, in the sense that most of the colonized states, post-colonial states, were able to deracialize. Deracialization was largely successful in much of the continent, but detribalization remains incomplete. The ethnic subjectivity remains very, very potent in some of our countries. Our states also remain fragmented on the question of redistribution. How should it proceed? Do we proceed along the lines that are drawn by the colonial state and its mode of governing, which was thoroughly identitarian? So do we distribute on the basis of this gendered, class, ethnic, racial categories of religious, familial, or do we follow the mode of redistribution that has mainly been taken a kind of universalist approach to the citizenry? So because of this tension and this kind of incomplete transition to democracy and the failure, I think, especially from the late 80s of the redistribution project, the stakes attached to multi-party politics and multi-party elections since its resumption, in Kenya at least, have been extremely high. My particular focus is on electoral violence. Partly it was a methodological choice because there's a lot we know already about rape and sexual violence in other contexts, in contexts of war, in contexts of where there are extreme kind of, where in enclaves where mineral extraction, contexts like the DRC, where there've been some really good political economy critiques, but not enough about a very particular, these very particular epochs in what we understand as liberal democracy. This is by no means to accept the notion. I'm critical of it, but when we have to understand and critique liberal democracy on its terms. One of its terms, of course, is that you are having regular elections every 4 or 5 years, and you are having this rule of law, there's free media, free press, and all these kinds of things. So I took one of the markers, which is around elections, as a basis of my analysis. So, and in that context, in that electioneering context, I was concerned with the function that violence appears to play in the electoral context. So I think partly drawing on the notions of instrumentalization of violence, maybe not very conclusively, I think, because my intention had been to look purely at try to understand sexual violence structurally, but it ended up being a broader critique of the state itself. So, concerned with the function that violence seems to play in context of non-protracted political contestations. It's a small window, an electioneering window, which is a couple of months, not just the election period, but also where the state, and this is, I think, the important point, where the state bureaucracy is intact. We go into elections with a state that we assume can reasonably organize these political competitions. So the state bureaucracy is intact, and survivors of violence can therefore reasonably or retain a reasonable basis upon which to expect the state to respond to their specific claims, whether it's claims around security or, safety and so on. So, the questions that emerge from this is what can the nature of the state response to survivors of gendered violence tell us about the nature of the state itself? Do elections produce a state of exception against which forms of political organizing, exceed liberal norms of order, of equality, of rule of law? Or is what we are witnessing in the late stages of democratization a demand for an incorporation of these kinds of exceptional politics. And where I'm talking about exceptional politics here, I'm specifically, sorry, hold on a second. I'm specifically thinking about politicization of ethnicity, precisely because liberal democracy has tended to treat ethnicity and all these other markers, whether they are caste or race or whatever, as aberrations, and not as, in fact, reflecting something of a deviation from the democracy. How might we account for post-colonial subjects whose legibility to the state is ethnically bounded and where ethnicity seems to have configured the historical, social, economic, and political mapping of subjectivity onto the bodies of women? In post-colonizing nation states, whose sovereignty is on the decline, a lot of interesting arguments are now emerging that when we look at globalization and just the opening up of countries, the breaking open of the traditional and national boundaries or economic ones, sovereignty itself is shifting very much from the nation state to the political economy, the global political economy itself, financialized capitalism, and so on. So where the sovereignty of nation states is on the decline, perhaps the problem of violence signifies a demarcation between the ability of the state to draw consensus from citizens through social provisioning. There are many ways in which states get citizens to comply and derive consent. And the absence of, so in the absence of states that have been so weakened, many under neoliberalism, is it that the state is resorting to some form of force, violation of rights, whether it's doing it directly or whether it is allowing it to happen in order to continue to derive consent, the consent of the governed? Such an approach to understanding gendered violence exceeds the limitations engendered by focusing on acts of violence. So there's, in many ways, this came from a dissatisfaction, in a sense, with the focus on the acts of violence, which I don't think tell us enough, but also importantly, which ultimately tend to reduce the state to an authoritarian machine or a police state. Because when we look at, even more recently, across the Southern Africa, South Africa, where we've had feminist calls of the state to protect women against rape, everyday violence. What we are actually inadvertently ushering in or calling we are calling the state to use its mode of protection, which is usually through the police, which is a mode of force. So are we enacting that? So a focus on the structural form of the colonial and the post-colonial state, I think, enables a critique of the structures, conditions, and institutions that produce violence as a form of exclusion that keep women out of politics. But so it's in a sense a continuation of the colonial logic. We need these bodies. We need women, these laboring bodies, but we cannot acknowledge them as political subjects. Why that is the case, I think, is the question of a broader discussion. My choice to locate the analysis in a critique of the abstract notion of democracy is as such an attempt to unshackle violence from its identification with backwardness, right, and disorder. Any form of violence in the context of democratic politics is seen as illiberal violence. there might be some truth in that. But if we take seriously these legacies, if we take seriously the modes of incorporation of women into the state, both the colonial state and the post-colonial state, then we see some continuations and logics of violence that actually exceed just a political critique of the violence as some kind of backward response. And to place it alongside critical post-colonial scholarship that has sought to show the violence of modernity itself. So a critique of these modernist legacies of the colonial state is also a thoroughly modern state in a sense. So the book ultimately became a critique of the liberal democratic state, whose inherent instability and violence in the post-colonial world I sought to show as highly gendered by its antecedents in history. I see the deployment of gendered violence in politics as influenced in the first instance by the capitalist interests vested in the colonial state and its imperative to exploit laboring women. Second, in the nature of the post-colonial state and politics largely captured by ethnic bourgeois class interests, and in the third instance by neoliberal political ideology that has remained, and this I think is the critical point, that the neoliberal political ideology has remained largely disarticulated from women's structural positions, not just in Kenyan society, but more broadly. So the willingness there's a chapter, I think chapter 5 in the book, where I look at the women's movements, women's rights organizations, and the willingness to deal with women, because our response to that colonial erasure of women as political subjects has been to say, okay, let us push for women's political participation. And that is perfectly fine, but it has been at the expense of a more structural engagement of women as laboring subjects. If indeed the idea that the condition of possibility of the stabilization, not just of the colonial state, but of the post-colonial state. We saw that during the COVID pandemic. It was a good period for many of us who've been talking about the care economy and social reproduction, when the world ground to a standstill. And suddenly we had to deal with this category that was being called essential. Most of it was the labor that we've been talking about. This is what keeps the not just the economies moving, but also that states continue to derive a massive amount of their not legibility, but the consent that they use to govern based on this kind of labor. There's not enough time. I was hoping to give a brief overview of the chapters, but I see that I have just 3 more minutes. So I'll go to just in the conclusion, and I hope that they'll come up in the discussion of the two discussants and from those attending. One is to lay emphasis on, there's nothing that says that women are uniquely rapeable, so to lay emphasis, as we tend to do in the feminist literature, on the unique rapeability of women, is to ignore the particular ways in which the colonial mode of rule gradually desubjectivated women through the political economy of colonial capital accumulation. And to say that there's something very instrumental about why women are raped, but I think this is also applicable in context of war. We can never think about gender on its own. We always think about it in its articulation to the nation, to ethnicity, to women as laboring, even if an enemy army is raping women, there's something more than just let's go and violate these women. And one of the mechanisms through which ethnicity has survived as a dominant mode of political mobilization is through its mapping onto the bodies of women. I explore this idea of mapping throughout the book, first historically in I think in chapter 2 of the book, where I look at the colonial political economy and the sort of subjectivation of women through productive and the reproductive labor economy. I also look at the religion, the question of religion and religious institutions and civil society organizations. So this idea of mapping is one of the ways in which we see ethnicity surviving so much and reaching for certain women. There is a primary contradiction that runs through, or a tension that runs through the book, that the failure of liberal politics to recognize the force of politicized ethnicity in the production of new subjects and subjectivities is something that we need to be concerned with. Liberalism's claims to equality, justice, freedom, and fairness remain untranslatable to tribalized populations whose access to civic spaces of liberal politics has been conditioned upon a universalism that precludes the identitarian particularities of produced by colonial rule. Again, remember that the colonial state, the bifurcation of the colonial state was such that for the urban realm, the language of rights were accorded, right? And this was the language that was only accessible mostly to the ruling colonial class and a small section of mostly male urban elite. For the majority of the colonized, it was the language of tradition, not the language of rights. But here we are, and this has remained. You know, we keep asking in the literature, why do traditional institutions remain so forceful? Why do they remain so influential? Whether we are looking at questions of land access for women, the question of resources, the question of justice for the majority at not just in rural but also in urban. Why has it remained? And part of it is that we are practicing politics that is not translatable across two realms that are very fundamental to how people actually experience politics on an everyday basis. There's also a critique, of course, in the book of the liberal women's rights agenda. There's a very forceful, in my view, interpellation of gendered subjects only. You want women. This is not just a critique of the NGOs. It's the liberal state, liberalism itself requires you to always, even the Constitution, you're called by, you have to choose which one you want to appear. Are you appearing to the state as a woman? Are you appearing to the state as a person of a certain ethnicity or a certain sexuality? There's no space to appear as all those sort of a constituted subjectivity at once. And this is part of the problem, because our historical interpellation was that when we talk about intersectionality all the time, that's part of it. That has to be part of our critique of intersectionality. When we think about in intersectional ways, how do we, why are we only called, we are supposed to answer by one name. I am a Black woman of a certain ethnicity, age, and class, but I always have to choose only one. So necessarily what we end up with is a kind of ahistorical, acontextual, apolitical nature of rights, because what is not called is depoliticized, and so on. And I think the challenge really is with the conceptualization of structural violence, which interrogates how it is that we might understand the objective violence of the structures, of the conditions, and of the institutions that daily structure our life, And I don't think anything about this kind of structuring can be understood outside of history. You know, subjects of violence as fundamentally historical subjects. We have to take that seriously. So rather than an anomaly, my reading conclusively is that the persistence of violence ought to be understood as a characteristic concealed within the historically gendered and ethnicized trajectory of state formation in Kenya. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Lyn. I think that gave a very good overview of some of the main points in the book. And we will be able to get back to specific parts or questions related to your presentation. I will encourage the audience to put in their questions in the Q&A section. And then I will read them up after we have listened to our discussants. First, we will have Shingirai Metere, who is a postdoc here at NICE. So I will give the floor to you.
Thank you so much, Diana, and thank you, Prof. Ossome, for your reflections, and also just for the amount of work that went into your thesis and then the book. I mean, canvassing the perspectives of 200 women in comparison to what we're able to achieve it creates a foundation that the rest of us as feminists can rest on, because of the amount of the dedication that you've had to your work. So thank you so much. I am going to present within the context of continuities and shifts, and my focus in my presentation is going to be what we've observed as researchers at NICE in the continuities and shifts in the typology of violence as it relates to women when they're running for political office. So one of the distinctions that I will make before I begin is that whereas your work looked at women as a whole, both as political participants and as political candidates, and I'm assuming as women who were deciding to vote, and some who are not yet eligible to vote. Our work focuses primarily on the experiences of women political candidates, so women who have run for elections. I'm going to share my screen. So basically, I am going to speak to the themes of gender, ethnicity, and violence as they relate to your book, but mapping the shifts and the continuities that we've observed. Particularly, I'm going to look at the nature of these shifts and what we've perceived at a preliminary stage as being drivers for this violence. Structurally, I'm going to look first at the importance of Prof. Ossome's work in understanding the nature of gendered electoral violence. I'm going to look then at our preliminary findings from the project, and then just one slide on how we could respond, what the work provokes us to think more deeply about it, and what the data is provoking us to think more deeply about and respond to as researchers and policymakers. So the first thing that I wanted to focus on as both as a discussant and as a researcher is the importance of this book that we're focusing on today, and what it guides, the guidelines that it provides for us as thinkers and as writers and researchers. The first important thing that I picked up is that it is important to be intersectional in one's approach to analyzing democracy, elections, and a society's experiences with democracy. And I think Professor Ossome said it best when she concluded that what is not called is then depoliticized. And one of the things that happens often when we analyze political violence, maybe because of how topical these sorts of events are to high politics. We will say there's been political violence in Kenya. And so people will say, what is Kenya's problem, without having the concern of what are the various identities of Kenyan people and what are their histories? How have they arrived at a place where, when it's time to exercise their right to vote, that that violence could erupt? And what's the nature of the Kenyan state? Who are the constituents of the Kenyan state? Why, if they are mobilizing violence to their benefit, why is this taking place? Basically, breaking down the different components of who exists in the society, and paying attention to those particularities. I make the point here that specific identity markers such as gender, class, and ethnicity impact how a person navigates the political system, and therefore it'll impact the way that they participate within elections. Another point that I thought was really important when I was reading your work is that it's clear that it's important for us to pay attention when violence erupts before, during, and after elections. And it's important to be intersectional in our understanding or our analysis of the drivers of violence, because there's no singular driver of violence. Violence is complex. Its impacts are multidimensional. Its drivers are a mixture of historic tensions and contemporary power dynamics, be those the ones that come from the colonial state, the recomposition of the post-colonial African state, the ways in which our societies are gendered, the way that our traditional beliefs impact the way that we navigate the world. And so when we think about violence, we should not just consider it to have a singular, it might have a point in history where there's a trigger to the violence, but there's no singular driver of violence, and that's important to keep in mind. And when it comes to Kenya in particular, I've made the point here that Kenya's experiences with political violence is gendered, ethnicized, and classed. And each one interacts with the other to create a specific type of oppression, a specific type of exclusion, and a susceptibility to political violence. And therefore, separating these categories is not useful for us as researchers or as policy thinkers, because these factors operate together simultaneously and at once. Separating them gives only part of the explanation, and therefore only part of the solution. What I'm going to do next is move on to what we've been doing. And so if we use the contributions in the book as a foundation to think more deeply about the work that we are doing, what I'm hoping this section can do is to just look at what we have found in the field, and speak to the themes that have come up in the book. What we conducted data collection at the beginning of this year, in January and February in 2024, as our director, Dr. Therese, spoke about, that we had a lot of assistance from different organizations in Kenya, which we're very, very thankful for. We conducted in-depth, semi-structured interviews with women who participated in one or more elections at the county and national level. And we focused primarily on 3 research sites: Nairobi County, with a particular focus on Kibera, even though we then did speak to women who were outside that constituency. We then also interviewed women in Nakuru. And then we also interviewed women in Uasin Gishu, with a particular focus on Eldoret, in Eldoret town. And so when we chose these research sites, one of the things that drew us to them, particularly, for instance, in Nakuru, was just the high number of women who had participated in elections and the high number of women who then were elected in elections. And one of the things that was really interesting, because we also did get assistance from the IEBC, was that when we went through the list of women who had been nominated to run for elections, in comparison to Nairobi and in comparison to Uasin Gishu, Nakuru really had a really high number of women who had contested as candidates, which was very encouraging and which drew us to them. When we look at Eldoret, one of the things that was really apparent to us was just the proportion of the national vote that the president was able to garner in his hometown. And that was an indication to us that maybe something else is happening there that we need to pay attention to. And what we then found, similar to your work, is that ethnicity played a large role in people's political identity and I guess his legitimacy in his county. And then the last place that we looked at was Nairobi, and we had a particular focus on Kibera just because of, one, the sheer density and the possibility of getting a wide variety of perspectives. It has 5 constituencies, I think, and not 5 constituencies. It has 85 wards. And that is one of the largest in Nairobi County. I think Nairobi County has got 17 sub awards or sub county or constituencies. And so we found it to be just a melting pot of diverse views. And yeah, that is what we found as well. When it comes to our sample, one of the things that we noted was there was a very ethnically diverse sample. We had perspectives from women majority, Kikuyu and Kalenjin, but we also had perspective from Luo women, people of Nubian descent, people who were Meru. There were a few people within the group of Kalenjin who then specified their well, I guess what they would consider to be a sub-ethnicity to themselves, but very few of them self-identified as that. Most of them self-identified in the larger group. One of the other interesting things which I've put into this table is just the spread of the women who we spoke to. So of the women that we spoke to, 65% of them contested as MCAs. 35% of them contested as MPs or women reps. So the majority of the perspectives were from women who were running for local county seats. Of the women that we spoke to, 15% were elected, 85% were unelected. We thought that that was really, it brings a lot of diversity of views, but a richness of views in the sense that many times the perspectives of women who have been elected are very different from those who have not been elected and who are considering running again or who are no longer considering running again because their experiences are going to be different because in one, they have not broken through to the point of representation, which often means that they are not members of the political elite, but also because their perspectives give an indication to what the real barriers were that continue to inform why women stay out of politics.
Shengirai, I'm going to have to ask you to jump to some of the, if you have some conclusions. There's only a few minutes left of your trip as a discussant. I don't know if you can wrap it up somehow. I don't know how much you have left.
Okay, thank you. The last thing that I wanted to note here was that 80% of the women had a political party affiliation, while 20% were independent candidates. And one of the good things was that 50% of the women were participating for elections the first time, and the other 50% this was their second or third election, which also gave us a diversity of views. The last key determinant that we thought was really interesting as well was age distribution of the women that we spoke to. 17% were below the age of 35. Between 35 and 50, we had 55% of the women being between those ages, and then 28% were above the age of 50. This was interesting because their ages also informed, rather, depending on the age of the woman, they had different experiences. So one of the things that we found, which in relation to your work, was that ethnicity remains a key political determinant for who is successful in elections, who is nominated for elections, and who's excluded from the elections. A key shift that we've noticed is, which is a shift but a continuity, is that ethnicity is continued to be mapped on the bodies of women, and the main conduit for that through this, which is done, is through the political party. So ethnicity is mapped onto the bodies of women, most dominantly expressed through their political party affiliation. So if a specific political party is dominated by candidates of a particular ethnic group, then that party in that region acts as the key mobilizer for politicized ethnicity. And it is also the key inscriber of ethnicity onto the woman's body as a political candidate. It plays a crucial role in their experiences, and we noted this in Nakuru and Wasengishu in particular, where specific dominant ethnicities had women of particular ethnicities which were dominant had different experiences from those who were not dominant. These experiences were different within the party and outside the party. So if I make an example of what we observed in Wasengishu, is that the majority of women who were successful in being nominated to the UDA ticket were from the dominant ethnicity. What they then experienced within their party was different from what women who were unable to get nominated within the party experienced. So all of them responded by saying they did experience some form of political violence, whether it was physical violence, sexual harassment, or what we consider to be semiotic violence within the party, but also the women who were of different ethnicities experienced different types of violence outside the party because they were not of the dominant ethnic group. I won't spend too much time on that.
No, I'm afraid you will have to end here, unless, and maybe you can give a concluding comment for now, and then I will have to turn it over to Caroline.
The last finding was that age was a key determinant for women's experiences. Women of different ages, particularly younger women, experienced more significant acts of political violence, more significant threats to their bodies, and sexual violence and unwanted sexual attention. I think the last thing that I will say is that one of the key things that the book allows us to think about is we should be asking critical questions about the continued manifestation of gender political violence within the context of a functioning state. We should be particularly critical and concerned when calls for gender equality or women's participation are constrained by the state itself. And when it comes to policies, we should think more in a pluralistic or intersectional way when it comes to responding to gendered electoral violence, because effective policies must respond to the drivers of violence rather than to violence itself. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And now I will hand over to Caroline. Please, the platform is yours. Shingirai, will you stop sharing?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Diana, and thank you, Prof. And Shingirai, for the very powerful presentations. I'll take my notes just from where the two presenters before me. They've covered a lot of the issues that are on my notes. But I start my analysis by saying that gender-based violence is really a paradoxical overview of Kenya's multipartism, because we see from Kenya's history that gender-based violence has been prevalent for as long as we've had multipartism. So we note that in 1992, 97, 2007, and also the 2017 elections are the periods during which we've had violence. But also an interesting observation is that violence is worst when there's an incumbent defending their seat. So we note that in 2002, 2013, and 2022, when the incumbent was, the incumbent's term was ending, the violence was less. Another overview that I would like to say in Kenya is also that this violence often takes a communal shape. And this communalship could be ethnic, it could be clan, it could also be class, you know, and now increasingly, you know, other forms of identity, as we are seeing. But it's also a twist that we note, you know, there's the issue of patriarchy, power relations, money, and also different demographics such as age. Very quickly, just touching on, I mean, there was an issue around these drivers of violence, and a lot have been spoken about, you know, the polarization on the basis of ethnicity, clan, but also intersectionality with other issues such as gender, age, and religion, because we note that as much as Shingirai has noted in her presentation, where there's either ethnic divisions, a party is stronger than the other one, then that will show itself differently from where you have a homogeneous political party, but then they're running against, you know, clans, against minority and majority communities in an area with one stronghold of a political party. Of course, the power relations, our politics also is you know, fast the post, so the winner takes it all, and that relates in how people understand in terms of distribution of resources and access to resources, and this perpetuates the violence that we see. Again, also our political mobilization is based on ethnicity. And an interesting twist is in the last election, we saw class emerge as a form of political mobilization that we've not witnessed in previous elections in Kenya. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention the issue of land also, because land, especially during elections, becomes a very emotive issue. And areas where land is either perceived to be in the hands of the wrong community or in the hands of the minority community, then this always acts as a driver of conflict. Professor Lyn has, and also Shingirai, they've talked about the urban poor areas, the informal sectors. Again, these are also space hotspots where violence has been witnessed in the past. And here, again, the political class mobilized on the basis of ethnicity, economic, but also gender disparities. And we've seen a lot of gender-based violence happening more in these informal areas. I wanted to focus my presentation more on the shift that we have seen, especially in Kenya's context. And I wanted to start, you know, from the basis of the 2010 constitution. You know, the constitution brought about changes, you know, with devolution. And so one of the shifts is, of course, that the violence shifts from being just a national issue to a regional issue, a county-based issue, because then this power mapping, resource distribution also takes a county shape, and not all counties are homogeneous. But most importantly, I think the shift and its focus, and I focus this a lot on the last election, the 2022 election, where we saw less physical violence, but more online violence, and I'll speak about it, and say that, you know, the creation of specific positions for women, the women rep positions, and has shifted the way community looks at women as leaders. And so as Mzalendo Trust, we did a research in 2019, and what was very interesting was that before then, you know, about 40 counties in the country had never elected women, either as MPs or even as MCAs at that point. But what we are seeing now with devolution and with the demystification of women's leadership, you can see that a number of counties, including those most patriarchal, are now electing women. In fact, including one of the counties that currently has a female governor, although again, courtesy of the same, you know, patriarchy and other issues, she's not had a very easy time. In 2013, again, when this position came up, it was a driver of violence against women because, you know, there was a misconception that the women's rep position was all women needed to run for. And therefore, any woman who was contesting for a position outside the women's rep was seen to be taking what belonged to the men. A shift is that we have seen now, you know, a shift in that, because now you see more women being elected to single constituency seats. We see more women elected as governors. We see more women as elected as senators. So from 2013 2013, where we had 0 governors, 0 senators. Now we have 3 and 7, respectively. Another shift is on the party processes. We've talked about, and Prof also alluded to, and in her presentation about, strong political parties. And we do know that a lot of this gender-based violence in politics, especially takes place during party primaries. And so for us, we've seen that legislative changes and administrative changes to the way political party primaries and nomination processes are done has had a positive impact in reducing the prevalence of physical violence. But not to say that all is rosy, because in 2022, for example, we saw, and a lot of research done during both the 2022 election shows that the violence then shifted to the online spaces. And so again, if you look at the online violence, you also see the ethnic, the skewed ethnic violence that targets different candidates, but with a twist, because this online bullying, the sexual harassment, means that the victims then don't suffer just local violence, but this is now truncated from county to national and sometimes international. We see a lot of cases of misinformation and disinformation taking that same ethnic angle, but now targeting more women who are portrayed as being unfit, being unworthy, being incapable of leading, and undeserving of leadership. And again, depending on where the woman in question is running, whether they are running from a community that have different ethnic balances, whether they are running against a political outfit that has a majority outfit, this then seems to affect how the sort of violence that targets the women, even though that violence now is more online than physical. There was a question as to what lessons we can learn from Kenya, and to say that Prof has talked about the paradox of democracy and how women's struggles are often not considered, and this now even Kenya prides herself in having one of the most progressive constitutions, but 14 years since the promulgation of the constitution, the issue of the 2/3, the issue of equality, the issue of fair inclusion of women, it remains the one area that is not given the attention, remains the one area that that has not been given the legal and the legislative framework to address the issues. And so the erasure of women's contributions, and even when the constitution gives them the powers, the power plays, the power plays between the political class, the disregard for the specific provisions that touch on the women's politics, perhaps because of the issues that we talked about, that have been spoken about, the issue of reproductive powers of women, the invisibility of women in these political spaces continues to be perpetuated by the failure to enact in full the provisions of the Constitution. Having said that, though, I think we've seen a bit of progress. We've seen that political parties can be an enabler, but also can help mitigate against violence. I think Kenya has done well in terms of electoral sanctions, disciplinary actions, codes of conduct that have acted to deter political violence. I think multi-sectoral approaches that Kenya has utilized in the last, especially during the last elections, whether it's training and capacity of building of police, religious leaders, but not doing this in silos, because what we've seen before is, you have police in one area, you have civil society in another, religious groups in another, but increasingly you see a more collaborative and multi-sectoral approaches, and courtesy of that, you then see that the 2022 elections, for example, had the lowest cases of police brutality, whether against women, but also overall.
Caroline, can I ask you to wrap up now? Sorry. Can I ask you
just
to wrap up?
And I'll wrap up. One of them is the media. I think the media hasn't come out strongly in the conversation as both an ally and an important partner in addressing political gender-based violence, and also the role that money plays in politics, and increasingly how that contributes to the safety and security or lack thereof of female candidates, and therefore perpetuates the violence. In our research on cost of politics, we see that women have to spend more in terms of safety and security, but we also see that male candidates spend more money funding political gangs that are then used to perpetuate this violence against women. I mean, it's a consistent budget line. So to then say that it will be, it is important for us to not see, democracy and multipartyism as a panacea for good governance, and to assume that just because we are having good, transparent elections, that there are no challenges that exist, especially when it comes to violence against women. But most importantly, I think the intersectionality of looking at gender-based violence from an ethnic mobilization, from a class mobilization is important, because this is often overlooked. And if we are to then address all these other issues of polarization, then it is important that we look at its impact on gender, its gendered impact, and how, when we are coming up with solutions, whether be it constitutional, be it legal, be it institutional, how that then can help identify and address some of the challenges that we then face. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to our discussants. There will not be any time at this point, Lyn, for you to respond to the discussants, because we have some questions from the...
Diana.
Sorry, I will give you a little bit of time after we have addressed the questions from the audience to make a short statement. So the first question is from Heather Melkabi, and she is asking, how is religion or faith playing a part in women's electoral participation? Lyn, this is actually something that you have focused on in your book. So I don't know if you could give a reply to that. Not too long though.
Yeah. Thanks for this question. It's an important one. If you look at the history of the church in Kenya, I mean, it's a long history from the colonial period with this kind of intervention and interplay between the church and the missionaries, but also in the post-colonial period. The church in Kenya actually had a very progressive place in the early periods of political liberalization. And in many ways, I think the problem is that the church stepped in to became a basis of social provisioning where the state was failing. When we look at the structural adjustment period, when the state basically withdraws from public services, the social state withdraws. And we see a lot of the responses, whether it's a response to internally displaced people, when we started seeing electioneering violence from the early 90s, it was the church that was largely responding to people who had been displaced, women who'd been violated, even up until the 2007 period. So the church has historically been a huge trap for women, not because women necessarily like church or praying more than men, but because, in my view, we have to also read it around this kind of reproductive labor burden that predominantly falls on women, and the need to respond to that question. So So I think we have to see, what the church in Kenya and its behavior has shown us is it dispels this, what is actually in the mainstream literature, the idea of a separation between the church and the state. And today, even Pentecostal churches, which must become an object of our analysis because of just how prevalent they are across the continent, must also become an object of our analysis. We gradually saw the church in Kenya becoming complicit to the extent that prior to the elections in 2007, I have some of the empirical data in the book where I talk about how the church was literally telling people how to vote, in the sense that it had completely been the question of ethnicity that it seemed immune to, it did not escape eventually. I think the most stark example I give in the book was the Kiambaa fire, where women and children went to seek shelter. This was in Eldoret, in a church, and they were burnt to death. And, we could say they were burnt because they're women, but it became clear that they were burnt. The ethnicity played a big role in why those particular women were targeted. But the fact that the church lost its sanctity as a place where people could seek shelter, the way we saw in Rwanda during the genocide, means that it's a political question. It means that it actually, to me, symbolizes the complete politicization of the church itself. There's a longer discussion of this, I think, in chapter 4 of the book. But it has been an important domain of this ethnic mapping, partly because women or gendered subjects have been such a huge constituency of the church, linked to the failure of the social state itself.
Yes. Thank you very much for this reply. There's also another question, which is somewhat two-folded. It is stating, for the study being done in Kenya in 2022, I'm not too sure which who this is especially directed to, but it states, was it not expected that women with a certain ethnicity would dominate elections in AG? For example, Nakuru, mainly populated by Kikuyus. If yes, what are some of the best practices to overcome ethnically tied elections driven by women as leaders / role models? And also something about online violence. Since online violence was mentioned, were there any successful online campaigns aimed to shut down online violence against women political candidates? I don't know, Lyn, do you have anything to this or?
Yeah, I can respond to the first part, but I think Caroline should respond to the question of online violence, and I think she can also respond. But more broadly, this question of, yes, it remains obvious that people are going to vote along ethnic lines. There's nothing to me fundamentally wrong about ethnic identification. It should be benign. The problem in our context is that it is not, right? Why it remains a problem that has to be our focus is because ethnicity remains a primary means through which people not only access the state, but also the resources of the state. And to make sure that ethnicity is becomes a benign kind of not force, but factor in our elections, then this link between it and political power and economic access has to be we have to see that fragmented gradually. And I think that's what we've not been able to do. And I think that's the problem. But, fundamentally, there's nothing wrong. We are of multiple ethnicities, and we do seem to coexist until there's this very high stakes electoral violence. Elections themselves become a space and a mode of redistribution. This, again, to me, is a problem. It shouldn't be. The state itself should have a redistributive function, but it is so attached to these political competitions. And as a mode of redistribution, where we haven't resolved the kind of ethnic identification, then it remains a problem. So yes, it is obvious, but the fact that women vote as electoral blocks we can't see, it's not benign. It has a lot of stakes that are attached to it. And of course, violence sits at the tail end, as I think, Shingirai, I was very interested in the study you are mentioning, and Caroline too. I'll let you respond to the rest of it.
Caroline, can you respond to the second part?
Yeah, I would confirm in the affirmative that actually a lot of the civil society organizations in partnerships with media houses did carry out campaigns against online violence, but most importantly, also a lot of training on digital safety and security, especially with the political aspirants. And this is work that began, almost a year before the elections, just to train women leaders, women aspirants, what they needed to do to be safe and secure, in terms of their posting. But also, another part of that campaign was around, verification, what they were calling the Fumbua campaign, just making sure that, you're not perpetuating false narratives, you're not spreading fake news, you have verification, means of verifying information that's posted online. So I would say that that's one of the areas that received a lot of attention during the last elections because of the recognition that, it was one of the threats and also a major barrier that had been identified as impacting women's political participation. And it is true that there are quite a number of women that were discouraged or, dropped out because of online violence. Last but not least is to also
Caroline,
say that
can you turn on your camera, please?
Oh, sorry, my Wi-Fi is not so good, but yeah. Lastly, I was going to say that it's also important to note that, this violence against women presents itself differently, for more experienced political actors and for young people, young female aspirants. And we have done research to that we're calling, the invisible minority that face this violence, whether online or physical, differently from women that have been in political space for a bit longer than them. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we will have time for one more question. There are two different people in the audience that are asking about how the Kenyan experience relates to other African country contexts. One talks about Nigeria, the other talks about Cameroon. So they are asking if your literature review touches upon any other African country that's from Cameroon, but maybe you yourself can identify if there are any similar processes of mapping of ethnicity in other African contexts, or what researchers from other country contexts can learn from the Kenyan case study.
Yeah, I mean, my hope is that, I think the fundamental contribution that I hope the book makes is both a methodological one and a theoretical one. That's key. in sort of the markers of analysis that we need to look at. That said, I think, you know, the question of ethnicity is a problem of the post-colonial state in much of the Cameroon has not escaped this ethnic question at all, right? We've seen the violence there. I think 2011 was or 10 was the worst. Nigeria, interestingly, seemed to have tried to deal concretely with this question of regionalism and ethnicity. It has its problems in many ways, but in terms of federalism, the distribution, how the executive comes into power and so on, I think is an attempt. And there have been very interesting studies, including some recent PhD thesis in the institute where I am, that have tried to look at this problem. We are seeing the chickens come home to roost in South Africa, where for a long time, I think they denied the ethnic question, but we saw it in the last election, where KwaZulu-Natal fairly and squarely voted as an ethnic bloc. So it's not immune. This is a very recent democracy. So I think there are lessons that can be learned from the Kenyan context in our feminist critiques of violence, but with fidelity to feminist historical materialism, which has been my methodological lens, we have to subject every context to its own histories and its own structures. There's no way to generalize these questions, but we can certainly adopt a methodological approach that allows us to see some of these categories, especially class, but also ethnicity and gender and sexuality, as structural questions, not just as identities that are disarticulated from the structures of the state and from the economy.
Okay, thank you very much. We only have a very few minutes left, but I know that you're working on a new book project. Could you give us a very brief idea of what we should be looking forward to?
Yeah, I mean, the book is really a continuation of my preoccupation with the question of violence in the context of democratization. The title of the book is called Democracy's Subjections, Colonial Modernity and the Gendered Subject of Violence. And it's really thinking about, its fundamental argument is that the post-colonial state is in a way confronted by an ethical responsibility against violence. We are talking about decolonization a lot, but we can't talk about decolonization if we don't take seriously the ways in which states and economies are reproducing violence. But I'm dealing with, it's fundamentally a critique and an analysis of the link between colonialism, democracy, and gendered violence through drawing on anti-colonial feminist critique as an analytical framework, and arguing that trying to place the question of gendered labor, which is another huge preoccupation of mine. I work both at the intersection of political studies and political economy, and a large part of my work has been preoccupied with questions of social reproduction and gendered labor. So I bring that to bear in an analysis of politics and the state itself. Hopefully there'll be a forum to speak about that book when it's out.
We'll be happy. We'll be happy to host you again on this platform. And I would like to thank you, Lyn Ossome, for joining us today. I would also like to thank you very much, our discussants, Caroline Geiter and Shingirai Metero, and also to our director, Therese Schumander Magnussen, for her opening remarks. And then I can also encourage you to look into other resources we have on Kenya. For example, we have done a policy note. I can see that there's a link to this policy note now in the webinar chat. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon, and have a lovely rest of the day. Thank you very much.